His footsteps sounded louder than the applause had. George Michael walked back onto the empty stage after everyone had gone, and the silence hit him harder than the crowd. The lights were half dead. A microphone stood alone at center stage. He stopped beside it, still wearing the night on his shoulders, and for a moment he could not move. Only an hour earlier, the room had been alive. Thousands of voices had risen toward him like warmth. They had sung back every word, reached for him, cried for him, loved him from the dark. But now there were only cables on the floor, abandoned cups near the front rows, and the strange echo of being adored and then left alone. He touched the microphone stand with 2 fingers, almost carefully, as if it belonged to someone else. That was the part nobody warned him about. Not the performing, not the pressure, the aftermath, the sudden drop from being needed by an entire room to standing in the same place, completely unnecessary. George had known empty stages before. Wham had ended under bright lights and screaming love. Faith had put him at the center of the world. Alder had asked him to sing from a deeper wound. But this night felt different. He was not looking at the audience. He was looking at the absence they had left behind. The crew was somewhere in the distance, packing cases, lowering lights, speaking in tired, practical voices. They had jobs to do. George envied that. A cable had to be coiled. A case had to be shut. A truck had to be loaded. Grief had no such simple task. Loneliness did not come with instructions. He looked out over the empty seats. Row after row after row. During the show, each seat had held a face, a memory, a person who believed his voice belonged partly to them. Now the chairs looked like a field after a storm. Everything that had been loud had passed through. What remained was the damage and the quiet. Fame can fill a room, but it cannot stay with you when the room empties. That was the thought he could not shake. The public saw the miracle of a full arena. George felt the cruelty of what came after. The bigger the love sounded at night, the deeper the silence could feel when it left. He remembered being a boy in North London, singing to himself before the world knew his name. Back then, he wanted the room to listen. He wanted proof that he was more than the shy son trying to become someone. Now the rooms listened too much, and somehow the boy inside him still felt unheard. His father Jack had wanted him to be practical, strong, respectable in ways George could never fully fit. His mother Leslie had given him warmth, the kind that made his dreams feel less foolish. Standing there on the empty stage, he felt both of them somehow, the pressure to stand tall and the ache to be held. Then came the people he had lost. Anselmo, whose absence had changed the color of every song. Leslie, whose death removed the safest place in his heart. Friends, gone too soon. Years he could not recover. The stage had carried all of that while he sang. The audience heard beauty. He had felt the weight underneath. He sat down at the edge of the stage, legs hanging over the place where hands had reached for him hours earlier. No one was reaching now. That was not bitterness, it was truth. Audiences give what they can for a few hours, then return to their lives. The performer has to return to himself. That return was the hard part. Backstage, there would be towels, water, a quiet car, maybe a hotel room too large for one person. People imagine success as rooms opening. Sometimes success is just learning how many beautiful rooms a man can feel lonely inside. George knew too many of them. He took a breath and looked toward the upper seats. Darkness sat there like a witness. He could almost hear the crowd again, but memory is cruel that way. It gives you the sound without the people. It gives you the warmth without the body. It gives you a room full of ghosts and calls it a gift. Some nights, singing healed him for a little while. The music would rise, the band would lock in, and his voice would become bigger than his pain. But the healing had a time limit. When the last note ended, the old grief came back through the side door and waited for him in the quiet. That was why the empty stage frightened him. It told the truth too plainly. No lights could flatter it. No applause could soften it. No camera could turn it into a legend. A man stood where a star had stood, and the difference between the two was suddenly unbearable. He walked slowly across the stage, past the piano, past the taped marks on the floor, past the place where the spotlight had found him. Each step felt like walking through versions of himself. The Wham boy, the faith man, the grieving lover, the son without his mother, the generous stranger no one recognized. At the piano, he stopped. The lid was closed, but he rested one hand on it. So many of his private battles had ended up near keys. Songs had been the safest place to hide things that could not be said plainly. But tonight, he did not play. Tonight, the silence was already saying enough. He whispered something, maybe to himself, maybe to the people who were gone, maybe to no one at all. The words did not matter as much as the act of speaking into an empty room. When a man is used to being heard by thousands, whispering alone can feel like the most honest sound left. The empty stage did not judge him. That was its strange mercy. It did not ask for a hit. It did not ask for a smile. It did not ask him to explain the weight in his eyes. It simply held him there, tired and human, until the night stopped demanding that he be impressive. Maybe that is what he needed, not another ovation, but a place where he could stop performing after the performance. A place where George Michael could become George again, not fixed, not healed, just allowed to breathe without turning breath into entertainment. Eventually, a crew member appeared in the wings and paused, sensing something private. George turned his head, gave a small nod, and stood. Nothing dramatic happened, no collapse, no speech, just a tired man rising from the edge of a stage, because morning would come whether he was ready or not. He looked back once before leaving. The microphone was still there. The seats were still empty, but the stage no longer felt only cruel. It had held the applause and the silence. It had held the star and the man. It had shown him the wound, but also given the wound somewhere to stand. Years later, people would remember the concerts as proof of power. They would say his voice filled every corner. They would talk about the notes, the range, the magic. But perhaps the truest part happened after the magic ended, when he walked back alone and faced the silence nobody paid to hear. His footsteps had sounded louder than the applause, and maybe that is the secret behind so many George Michael songs. The world heard the voice, but the voice was often born after the crowd was gone. On an empty stage, in the dark, with no one watching, he was still trying to survive the silence.
If this story changed the way you remember George Michael, stay with us. There are more untold chapters still hidden behind the voice, the fame, and the silence. Like the video, subscribe, and let the next story find you.